Biology 11. This will be my last topic. It's an extra topic that discusses soil, focuses a little bit more on roots, and overall water balance. It's pretty neat when you look at how plants have been able to take advantage of some pretty minimalistic environments. Plants can grow on something as simple as rock. When you go back to our bryophytes, specifically moss, and when you look at the roots, and in particular, when you look at these amazing root structures, plants, if given enough time, would take society back. If you look at roads that have been left fallow and not maintained, the plants come back, they take it over. Roots are amazing structures, they keep us fed. Things like tubers, potatoes is what I'm thinking of. And there's a lot more there than meets the eye. So let's get into this. I think a really important topic is soil layers. Not many people really understand what's going on with soil. You have some, it's actually categorized, but I'll do this in a very sort of general way. The top layer of soil, if you think about leaf litter each year, you have something that's called the humus layer, and it's right up here. Leftover leaves, decaying organic matter, and it gets pressed into the soil year after year after year. Things like fungi and bacteria break it down, right? And as it gets pushed down into the what we call the topsoil. So let's do a little change in coloroonie here. You get into your topsoil, and go with the dark green. You get down into a layer that you call your topsoil, which of course is fairly nutrient rich. And you buy topsoil, go to a place like Costco, and you get a whole bag of soil, and you'll find worms cruising around on the topsoil. They'll come up into the organic humus layer. That's pretty well where they want to be. As you get down further into what you call the subsoil, you get down into your clay material, your sand, and that's kind of an important area because you can't just grow anything in any soil. For example, grapes in particular, they want to grow in sandy based soils. That sand is very good for drainage. Water can flow right through it, and it tends not to build up, much in the way of. It's not so bad for fungal infections and things like that that you'd associate with high water content. When you get down to your soil layer, right, or subsoil layer, I don't want brown again. I just did that. Down here, right, you can think of this as being quite rocky and fairly tough. As you go down further from that, you'll get down to pretty well your large sort of rocky region that we refer to kind of as our bedrock layer. And, well, let me put it this way. Think of the Canadian Shield. It's pretty well all sort of bedding rock. It's hard, it's impenetrable. You pretty well can't grow anything down there. And if you look at living things, right, they're pretty well up in the organic humus layer and down into about the subsoil layer. And that's about as far as they go. That's really the useful sort of region for them. So, soil 101. Humus is your organic top layer. And I think I know what this is going to do. 1 second. There we go. Your topsoil is sort of your clay sand mix, etc. Subsoil, you start to get down into the big rocks and the bedrock. That's pretty well solid rock. There's not much there to live on. And your dissolved oxygen content, it's not really where roots want to go. Okay, remember that even your roots are going to need some oxygen. So that's pretty well, once you get to subsoil, that's pretty well it. So it's important to talk about what kind of nutrients is the plant going after. Well, nitrogen, if you think about humans, nitrogen is an important component of protein. And you can't really grow leaves, stems, anything anything that's made of protein without nitrogen. Phosphorus, here's a hint, pH, think of that with flowering. A lot of plants will get exhausted after flowering year after year and they can't keep it up. Well, one of the tricks is to give them a little bit of phosphorus and give them a little kick. They can get pretty tired. I've got an amaryllis in my house, And it doesn't flower all the time, nor could it. It takes a tremendous amount of energy and it needs a little bit of fertilizer. Give it a little phosphorus, help it out. So, your other trace minerals, potassium, calcium, magnesium is a huge one for photosynthesis. Plants need trace amounts of that. Otherwise, they can't really photosynthesize. We saw those green little pancakes inside of the chloroplast. Well, as it turns out, the reason why they're green is because of a photosynthetic chemical called chlorophyll. That's actually where the magic happens. And you can think of leaves as solar panels. So when light strikes the green color, right, you get a production of energy, electrons, if you will, that plants can use to rip apart water and jam carbon dioxide and water together to make carbohydrates. Well, if you don't have magnesium, you're not really helping out chlorophyll. And you get the idea, it's not so good for photosynthesis. A listing of the trace elements are at the bottom: zinc, molybdenum, boron, copper, manganese. I think you get the idea. Okay. Interesting thing about fertilizer. If you ever looked at a bag of fertilizer and you're like, what's with the numbers? Why are there three numbers on there? Here's all you need to remember about that. It is the proportion of nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium. Okay, so what do you need to know about nitrogen? Well, if you want a nice green lawn and you want, well, let's back up. What does nitrogen do? Oh, look at that. Critical for leaf and stem growth or development. Okay, so let's put underneath each one. So overall growth, right? There we go. Potassium. Potassium. What's that for? Well, let's fill in potassium. Phosphorus is easy because we know it's for flowering. Potassium, as it turns out, is really good for promoting root development. So you don't just buy any bag of fertilizer. You have to think about it. If you want fertilizer that promotes root development, you maybe want to have a little bit of a higher number for potassium. If you want flowering, then make sure that your phosphorus content is pretty high. So we look at our bag of Mr. Fertilizer up there, and what I see is that this is a kind of fertilizer which looks like it's kind of more of the variety that would promote um, flower production and stimulate root development. It's going a little bit lighter on the nitrogen, but if you get a bag of fertilizer and pretty well you've got like a 900, that's just a general fertilizer used for plant growth. This is a little bit more about flowers and roots. So now you know. When you look at a bag of fertilizer, look at it and say NPK. It's funny because I always think of the name Enrique, but NPK. And now you know what each of the numbers means. And depending on the emphasis on each individual number, if it's higher or lower, you kind of in a general sense now know what it would be promoting. Secrets of the universe. They never tell you that on the bag. You just look at the bag and it's like, it's got three numbers. And you say, Mom, Dad, which one's, what's that for? Or if you care, that's another matter. Modified roots. We should look at them. Pretty cool when you get prop roots doing exactly what they say, propping up the plant like this. Right? There you go. And you see this a lot with mangrove trees because they'll be growing into the water and they'll be basically propping up the plant. Pretty cool. But there's something you've got to look at, and this is really interesting because there's a lot of tree planting in British Columbia. It's a very big part of what we do. Well, if you go and plant just any old tree, okay, and you don't pay attention to its roots, you've done the tree an incredible disservice, and you're going to have a very unsuccessful tree planting escapade. It turns out that there's a kind of fungus called mycorrhizae, okay, which you should inoculate on the roots of seedlings. Now, what the mycorrhizae tends to do is it's very good at absorbing water, and it is also good, really good, at picking up nitrogen. And that's really handy because nitrogen is in the air, And if you don't have, I'm trying to draw roots here, if you don't inoculate a seedling with mycorrhizal fungi, and it's like kind of like a white webbing. I'll show you another picture here. If you don't do that, you will get really crappy seedling growth because the plant will eventually try to seek out some mycorrhizal fungi, but you're putting the plant behind. Okay. Now it's not just mycorrhizae that some plants will associate with. What they might do is they might find some soil bacteria to hook up with and make these interesting little nodules. And some of these bacteria, like Pseudomonas aerugoscina, that's one. It's funny that I know that one by name, but some of these bacteria are good nitrogen fixers too. So it's a little bit of a deal. The plant gives up a little bit of its photosynthate, a little bit of its food, if you will, to the fungus, and the fungus helps out with nitrogen fixation and absorbing water. They just kind of do better together. So let's show you. I'll show you what mycorrhizal fungi look like. There we go. Mycorrhizae. And let's go to images. And it looks like webbing. A lot of students have told me that before. When you look at the fungus up close, it'll look a little bit like this. And the seedling needs this because it creates such a tremendous growth advantage. And you want to inoculate seedlings even when they're young. And underground, it makes a very substantial difference. Pop back here. If you want the trees to grow up nice and fast, give them this competitive advantage, and you'll do your forestry service quite a service. All right. Interestingly enough, root grafts. This is when two trees they'll I always think of the circumstance of the cherry tree. You can't get cherry trees to produce fruit unless there's a graft of one cherry tree root with another. It's sort of like a natural union between two trees. And sometimes roots can grow together, that's understood. But sometimes it's required for sexual reproduction. You would think that the flowers would be enough. My grandmother's tree would not produce, absolutely refused to produce cherries until a graft of another tree was placed upon it. Pretty interesting. Sometimes you see grafts of branches. You'll see that with apple trees. Instead of looking at roots, mind you, what they're doing, and I should show you that, it's kind of cool. It's how you get one apple tree to produce lots of different kinds of apples. So let's go tree grafting. Here it is. Really neat topic. Let's go to images. So grafting is nothing new to botany. You just create a cut. Let's see if I can find a simple one. Well, here's one way to go about doing it. You can create a cut into one branch, and you're essentially just hooking it up to the xylem and phloem of an existing plant. And as it grows, it will the plant will nurture it, and you can get different kinds of apples off one tree. And here you can see some grafts. Oops, let's make that a little bit bigger. Some grafts in action. It's pretty neat that you can do this. It's kind of like a xenotransplant, taking from one species and sticking it onto another. There's a neat graft right there. Right? Here's another. And once they heal together, this technique has been used for a very long time. A little trip around Google Images will show you this pretty expediently. As soon as I saw this graft here, I wanted to give you that sort of sense. But what do roots really do? Well, it looks like I lost my number on that one. One, they anchor. Okay, so obviously in some major windstorms, that's not enough. Up comes the tree. They provide anchorage, absorption, they conduct things, and in some case, they store things, right? So below we're looking at our taproot, which is dicot-like, and then our fibrous root, which is monocot-like. Wow. got cut off. Don't want to get too far into the description of roots. You can get pretty lost in it. Um, but suffice it to say, I like this little diagram here. Roots are an amazing place if you want to see mitosis going on. Roots have to burrow into the ground, so you'll see something called a root cap. It's this structure right here. And it's like a protective cap because the growing cells, they're very fine, and if you push them down into the ground, they would obviously suffer a lot of damage and be destroyed. But roots themselves go through a tremendous amount of mitosis. They get elongation, and then they get these lateral meristems growing off to the side, and those are the root hairs, which you see over here. And that's where the water absorption happens. I remember as a little kid watering the side of a plant thinking I was actually giving it a drink. No, not really. That's not how you do it. Water broadly around your apple tree or whatever it is so that the root tips, which have spread out, have a chance to do their job. Okay. But it's pretty amazing that so much work is going on in the roots where they're elongating amazingly like that, and then hooking into the primary plumbing, into the xylem and into the phloem. Now there was a neat little strip I told you about once upon a time, and it's right here, Caspers' little strip, right there. And when water flows in from the root hairs and it gets in here, and you can see the xylem, I'll circle it. As soon as it gets through here, it doesn't get back out. Okay, kind of like a roach motel. You check in, but you don't check out. It cannot get past there. It's a waterproof strip, and it's neat. It's shown it's shown right here if I go over it in yellow, and it prevents backflow. And because water is flowing in, that creates pressure from all the little root tips and from the radial root structures as they pass out from depends from the taproot or whatever it is, and that helps to push water up into the plant. So a neat little trick, right? Because the water particles themselves will then just begin to rise, right? Due to that pressure created by the plant, and it doesn't require energy. That's pretty neat stuff. Okay, folks, I promised to keep the root and soil lecture short. Before we go, sometimes what you'll see in soil is they'll talk about these A, O, B, and C horizons. For the purpose of this lecture, we talked about the O horizon, or the top is just more or less being the humus layer. And then we saw the topsoil, subsoil, and then just the underlying rock or the bedrock. And I forgot I had this sitting here. It's a neat little animation because a deciduous forest or coniferous forest, when you look at their soils, very similar. But if you go and examine grasslands or deserts, you get different soil profiles. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to put that on the site, and if you're interested and you're doing research, it'll be there for you to take a gander at. But in the meantime and in between time, folks, that's it. I'm done. This concludes quite a bit of material, and deservedly so for Kingdom Plant Day. All right, ladies and gentlemen, have a good one.